There's been an epidemic of Ponzi schemes over the last 20 years. Everybody knows about the most famous one, Bernie Madoff, as well as Scott Olstein, Alan Stanford, Tom Peters. And it seems like there's a new Ponzi scheme uncovered every week. After the bankruptcy court or district court appoints a trustee or receiver, he will typically try to recover or claw back payments made to investors. If you got paid back more than your original investment, then you're known as a net winner. If you just got paid the money that you invested or less, then you're known as a net loser. Generally, a trustee will claw back or try to claw back fake profits, but let you keep payments made to you in the amount of your original investment. This is not always the case, but it's generally true. If you got paid back more than your original investment, the trustee will demand that you return the money to the estate or the receivership. The theory the trustee uses to claw back money, especially so-called fake profits, is that all investors are part of the same class, and all investors were defrauded and should be treated equally. And early investors should not be allowed to profit, while later investors lose money. Of course, early investors will always make out ahead in a Ponzi scheme. Why is that? Because that's exactly what the nature of a Ponzi scheme is. The Ponzi perpetrator will pay off early investors and give them profits on purpose to encourage later investors. But once the music stops, the later investors typically are the ones to lose everything. The trustee will sue to claw back fake profits on the theory that this was really money stolen from later investors. The fake profits were simply cash that later investors, or so-called investors, gave to the perpetrator. Instead of investing in anything, the perpetrator simply used that new money to pay off early investors and create the fiction of a profit-producing enterprise. Trustee's clawback argument is that it is more fair to bring back the money paid to the early investors and redistribute that to all investors. However, there are problems with this approach. First, it's not particularly more fair. It's not particularly fair at all. Ponzi victims that have been paid so-called fake profits may have often spent the money, or they may be relying on that money for future plans or savings. Those folks often have no clue it was not a legitimate return on their investments. This money might represent savings accumulated over many years. And to force back the return of this money by trustees is arguably victimizing the same victims all over again. In other words, the Ponzi perpetrator may have robbed Peter to pay Paul, but now the trustee is robbing Paul to pay Peter. How is that fair? The theory is also on shaky legal grounds for a number of different reasons. First, the stolen goods analogy does not really hold water. If someone steals your car and sells it to a third party, it would seem fair to make that third party return the car and take the loss. Most people know or have a clue or realize when they buy stolen merchandise and that they're going to have to return it. They're taking a risk, and that's why people are careful about who they buy things from to make sure they have the right documentation. But in a Ponzi scheme often involves money that is commingled into a bank account and then paid to innocent investors who are legitimately entitled to it, and often with no possible way of knowing that the investment opportunity was actually a fake scheme and an opportunity for a Ponzi schemer. That innocent investor would not have any due notice or be expected to know that she was receiving stolen property. So it's much less fair to make that investor return the money. This is very different from someone buying a gold necklace out of the trunk of a Buick. In a Ponzi scheme, investors have no warning at all. And really, there's no reasonable requirement that they should know. A better analogy is a company that suddenly fails, let's say due to COVID. Early investors get paid profits, and later investors get wiped out. Should the early investors compensate the later investors because the later investors had bad timing or were just unlucky? Fairness does not demand loss sharing or restitution by innocent people. If a criminal gambles and spends a bunch of money that's stolen at the Gold Nugget in Atlantic City, can the extortion victim or the theft victim sue the casino to get his money back? The main reason that's not done is that the casino gave legitimate value in exchange for the money, arguably without any notice that it was stolen. Forcing the casino to return the money would just substitute one victim for another victim. In a Ponzi scheme, an early innocent investor gives value in the form of investing her capital and losing the opportunity to invest it and get a reasonable return elsewhere. Just like the casino, she has provided reasonably equivalent value for the return of her capital and a reasonable return. And just like the casino, she should not be forced to return the money. There is also the need for commercial predictability, which is very important in a commercial society. Early investors did not sign up to ensure that later investors would be made whole if the fund collapsed and turned into a Ponzi scheme. That is not predictable. It's not fair to retroactively wipe out the property rights of these innocent investors with basically no notice. It's not the government's business and may in fact be unconstitutional to force early investors who got lucky to make unlucky later investors whole or to provide restitution to later investors. They didn't sign up for that. There's no notice for that. There's no agreement to that. By doing this, the courts are creating and enforcing an obligation that nobody ever agreed to or expected. Another problem is selective prosecution. There are many instances where the commercial world simply does not abide by the clawback theory provided by trustees or receivers of enforced restitution by innocent investors. The first folks in an investment often get away with the most money. Look at stock and real estate bubbles. Look at network marketing. In none of these situations is there a clawback law that requires beneficiaries of a stock market bubble to give back so-called fake profits when other people are wiped out. Why are their profits not fake or less real than Ponzi profits? Sometimes life is not fair. When the government interferes with clawbacks, intervenes with clawbacks with giant hands of clay, it probably just makes things worse. There should be restitution, but the restitution should come from the state, not from other victims. The government can easily create a fund specifically for Ponzi victims, payable whenever anyone invests in any fund. Or investors could agree among themselves that if there is a Ponzi surprise, they should all share equally in the loss. The problem with the current application of fraudulent conveyance law by a trustee is that there's no notice, there's no agreement to it, and it unfairly shifts the burden of restitution onto innocent investors. If you're sued for a clawback by a trustee in the context of a Ponzi scheme, you have one main defense. The main defense is that you acted in good faith. Unfortunately, even this defense is applied unfairly in Ponzi scheme situations. The defense has been deemed an objective defense. What this means is that what you specifically knew or did not know is not relevant. The rule applies what a so-called reasonable person should have known. Unfortunately, the law favors unsophisticated investors, because the more unsophisticated you are, the less likely you're going to suspect a Ponzi scheme, and the less due diligence you'll do. The more sophisticated you are, the more you're able and capable of doing sophisticated due diligence. The problem is that the law discourages that due diligence by punishing whoever does the due diligence and then withdraws their money with knowledge of the Ponzi scheme prior to the withdrawal by clawing back the funds on the theory of bad faith. This is clearly an anti-whistleblower law. It discourages whistleblowing. It actually discourages investigation and reporting of a Ponzi scheme. What the law should be doing is encouraging those sophisticated investors to investigate whether a Ponzi scheme exists or not. If it did encourage investigation, then those Ponzi schemes would be shut down sooner rather than later. At the very least, there should be immunity from clawbacks for an investor who discovers fraud. And instead, that investor is focused on by the trustee or receiver.